The Call of the Canyon by Zane Grey. Chapter 8. At Flagstaff, where Carley arrived a few minutes before train time, she was too busily engaged with tickets and baggage to think of herself or the significance of leaving Arizona. But as she walked into the Pullman she overheard a passenger remark, "Regular old Arizona sunset," and that shook her heart. Suddenly she realized she had come to love the colorful sunsets, to watch and wait for them. And bitterly she thought how that was her way to learn the value of something when it was gone. The jerk and start of the train affected her with singular depressing shock. She had burned her last bridge behind her. She had unconsciously hoped for some incredible reversion of Glenn's mind or of her own. A sense of irreparable loss flooded over her, the first check to shame and humiliation. From her window she looked out to the southwest. Somewhere across the cedar and pine greened uplands lay Oak Creek Canyon, going to sleep in its purple and gold shadows of sunset. Banks of broken clouds hung to the horizon like continents and islands and reefs set in a turquoise sea. Shafts of sunlight streaked down through creamy-edged and purple-centered clouds. Vast flare of gold dominated the sunset background. When the train rounded a curve, Carley's strained vision became filled with the upheaved bulk of the San Francisco mountains. Ragged gray grass slopes and green forests on end, black fringed skylines, all pointed to the sharp clear peaks spearing the sky. And as she watched, the peaks slowly flushed with sunset hues, and the sky flared golden, and the strength of the eternal mountains stood out in sculpted sublimity. Every day for 2 months and more Carley had watched these peaks, at all hours in every mood, and they had unconsciously become a part of her thought. The train was relentlessly whirling her eastward. Soon they must become a memory. Tears blurred her sight. Poignant regret seemed added to the anguish she was suffering. Why had she not learned sooner to see the glory of the mountains, to appreciate the beauty and solitude? Why had she not understood herself? The next day through New Mexico she followed magnificent ranges and valleys, so different from the country she had seen coming west, so supremely beautiful that she wondered if she had only acquired the harvest of a seeing eye. But it was at sunset of the following day, when the train was speeding down the continental slope of prairie land beyond the Rockies, that the West took its ruthless revenge. Masses of strange cloud and singular light upon the green prairie and a luminosity in the sky drew Carley to the platform of her car, which was the last of the train. There she stood, gripping the iron gate, feeling the wind whip her hair and the iron-tracked ground speed from under her, spellbound and stricken at the sheer wonder and glory of the firmament, and the mountain range that it canopied so exquisitely. A rich and mellow light, singularly clear, seemed to flood out of some unknown source, for the sun was hidden. The clouds just above Carley hung low, and they were like thick, heavy smoke, mushrooming, coalescing, forming, and massing, of strange yellow cast of nature. It shaded westward into heliotrope, and this into a purple so royal, so matchless and rare, that Carley understood why the purple of the heavens could never be reproduced in paint. Here the cloud mass thinned and paled, and a tint of rose began to flush the billowy, flowery, creamy white. Then came the suppressing splendor of this cloud pageant. A vast canopy of shell pink, a sun-fired surface like an opal sea, rippled and webbed with the exquisite texture of an oriental fabric, pure, delicate, lovely, as no work of human hands could be. It mirrored all the warm, pearly tints of the inside whirl of the tropic nautilus. And it ended abruptly, a rounded depth of bank on a broad stream of clear sky, intensely blue, transparently blue, as if through the lambent depths shone the infinite firmament. The lower edge of this stream took the golden lighting of the sunset and was notched for all its horizon long length by the wondrous white glistening peaked range of the Rockies. Far to the north, standing aloof from the range, loomed up the great black bulk and noble white dome of Pikes Peak. Carley watched the sunset transfiguration of cloud and sky and mountain until all were cold and gray, and then she returned to her seat, thoughtful and sad, feeling that the West had mockingly flung at her one of its transient movements of loveliness. Nor had the West wholly finished with her. Next day the mellow gold of the Kansas wheat fields, endless and boundless as sunny sea, rich, waving in the wind, stretched away before her aching eyes for hours and hours. Here was the promise fulfilled, the bountiful harvest of the land, the strength of the West. The great Middle State had a heart of gold. East of Chicago, Carley began to feel that the long days and nights of riding, the ceaseless turning of the wheels, the constant and wearing stress of emotion, had removed her an immeasurable distance of miles in time and feeling from the scene of her catastrophe. Many days seemed to have passed. Many had been the hours of her bitter regret and anguish. Indiana and Ohio, with their green pastoral farms and numberless villages and thriving cities, denoted a country far removed and different from the West, and an approach to the populous East. Carley felt like a wanderer coming home. She was restlessly and impatiently glad, but her weariness of body and mind and the close atmosphere of the car rendered her extreme discomfort. Summer had laid its hot hand on the low country east of the Mississippi. Carley had wired her aunt and two of her intimate friends to meet her at the Grand Central Station. This reunion soon to come affected Carley in recurrent emotions of relief, gladness, and shame. She did not sleep well and arose early, and when the train reached Albany she felt that she could hardly endure the tedious hours. The majestic Hudson and the palatial mansions on the wooded bluffs proclaimed to Carley that she was back in the East. How long a time seemed to have passed! Either she was not the same or the aspect of everything had changed. But she believed that as soon as she got over the ordeal of meeting her friends and was home again, she would soon see things rationally. At last the train sheered away from the broad Hudson and entered the environs of New York. Carley sat perfectly still, to all outward appearances a calm, superbly poised New York woman returning home, but inwardly raging with contending tides. In her own sight she was a disgraceful failure, a prodigal sneaking back to the ease and protection of loyal friends who did not know her truly. Every familiar landmark in the approach to the city gave her a thrill, yet a vague, unsatisfied something lingered after each sensation. Then the train, with rush and roar, crossed the Harlem River to enter New York City. As one waking from a dream, Carley saw the blocks and squares of gray apartment houses and red buildings, the miles of roofs and chimneys, the long, hot, glaring streets full of playing children and cars. Then above the roar of the train sounded the high notes of a hurdy-gurdy. Indeed, she was home. Next to startle her was the dark tunnel, and then the slowing of the train to a stop. As she walked behind a porter up the long incline toward the station gate, her legs seemed to be dead. In the circle of expectant faces beyond the gate she saw her aunt's, eager and agitated, and then the handsome pale face of Eleanor Harmon, and beside her the sweet thin one of Beatrice Lovell. As they saw her, how quick the change from expectancy to joy! It seemed they all rushed upon her and embraced her and exclaimed over her together. Carley never recalled what she said, but her heart was full. "Oh, how perfectly stunning you look!" cried Eleanor, backing away from Carley and gazing with glad, surprised eyes. "Carley!" gasped Beatrice. "You wonderful golden-skinned goddess! You're young again, like you were in our school days." It was before Aunt Mary's shrewd, penetrating, loving gaze that Carley quailed. "Yes, Carley, you look well, better than I ever saw you. But—" "But—" "But I don't look happy," interrupted Carley. "I am happy to get home, to see you all. But—my heart is broken." A little shocked silence ensued. Then Carley found herself being led across the lower level and up the wide stairway. As she mounted to the vast domed cathedral-like chamber of the station, a strange sensation pierced her with a pang. Not the old thrill of leaving New York or returning, nor was it the welcome sight of the hurrying, well-dressed throng of travelers and commuters, nor the stately beauty of the station. Carley shut her eyes, and then she knew. The dim light of vast space above, the looming gray walls, shadowy with tracy figures, the lofty dome like the blue sky, brought back to her the walls of Oak Creek Canyon and the great caverns under the ramparts. As suddenly as she had shut her eyes, Carley opened them to face her friends. "Let me get it over quickly," she burst out, with hot blood surging to her face. "I hated the West. It was so raw, so violent, so big. I think I hate it more now. But it changed me, made me over physically, and did something to my soul, God knows what. And it has saved Glenn. Oh, he is wonderful. You would never know him. For long I had not the courage to tell him I came to bring him back East. I kept putting it off. I rode, I climbed, I camped, I lived outdoors. At first it nearly killed me. Then it grew bearable and easier until I forgot. I wouldn't be honest if I didn't admit now that somehow I had a wonderful time, in spite of all. Glenn's business is raising hogs. He has a hog ranch. Doesn't it sound sordid? But things are not always what they sound or seem. Glenn is absorbed in his work. I hated it. I expected to ridicule it. But I ended by infinitely respecting him. I learned through his hog raising the real nobility of work. Well, at last I found courage to ask him when he was coming back to New York. He said, 'Never.' I realized then my blindness, my selfishness. I could not be his wife and live there. I could not. I was too small, too miserable, too comfort-loving, too spoiled. And all the time he knew this, knew I'd never be big enough to marry him. That broke my heart. I left him free, and here I am. I beg you, don't ask me any more, and never to mention it to me, so I can forget." The tender, unspoken sympathy of women who loved her proved comforting in that trying hour. With the confession ruthlessly made, the hard compression in Carley's breast subsided, and her eyes cleared of a hateful dimness. When they reached the taxi stand outside the station, Carley felt a rush of hot, devitalized air from the street. She seemed not to be able to get air into her lungs. "Isn't it dreadfully hot?" she asked. "This is a cool spell to what we had last week," replied Eleanor. "Cool!" exclaimed Carley, as she wiped her moist face. "I wonder if you Easterners know the real significance of words." Then they entered a taxi, to be whisked away, apparently through a labyrinthine maze of cars and streets, where pedestrians had to run and jump for their lives. A congestion of traffic at Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street halted their taxi for a few moments, and here in the thick of it Carley had full assurance that she was back in the metropolis. Her sore heart eased somewhat at sight of the streams of people passing to and fro. How they rushed! Where were they going? What was their story? All the while her aunt held her hand, and Beatrice and Eleanor talked as fast as their tongues could wag. Then the taxi clattered on up the avenue to turn down a side street and presently stop at Carley's home. It was a modest 3-story brownstone house. Carley had been so benumbed by sensations that she did not imagine she could experience a new one. But peering out of the taxi, she gazed dubiously at the brownish red stone steps and front of her home. "I'm going to have it painted," she muttered, as if to herself. Her aunt and her friends laughed, glad and relieved to hear such a practical remark from Carley. How were they to divine that this brownish red stone was the color of desert rocks and canyon walls? In a few more moments Carley was inside the house, feeling a sense of protection in the familiar rooms that had been her home for 17 years. Once in the sanctity of her room, which was exactly as she had left it, her first action was to look in the mirror at her weary, dusty, heated face. Neither the brownness of it nor the shadow appeared to harmonize with the image of her that haunted the mirror. "Now," she whispered low, "it's done. I'm home. The old life or a new life. How to meet either? Now?" Thus she challenged her spirit, and her intelligence rang at her the imperative necessity for action, for excitement, for effort that left no time for rest or memory or wakefulness. She accepted the issue. She was glad of the stern fight ahead of her. She set her will and steeled her heart with all the pride and vanity and fury of a woman who has been defeated, but who scorned defeat. She was what birth and breeding and circumstance had made her. She would seek what the old life held. What with unpacking and chatting and telephoning and lunching, the day soon passed. Carley went to dinner with friends and later to a roof garden. The color and light, the gaiety and music, the news of acquaintances, the humor of the actors, all, in fact, except the unaccustomed heat and noise, were most welcome and diverting. That night she slept the sleep of weariness. Awakening early, she inaugurated a habit of getting up at once, instead of lolling in bed, and breakfasting there, and reading her mail, as had been her wont before going West. Then she went over business matters with her aunt, called on her lawyer and banker, took lunch with Rose Maynard, and spent the afternoon shopping. Strong as she was, the unaccustomed heat and the hard pavements and the jostle of shoppers and the continual rush of sensations wore her out so completely that she did not want any dinner. She talked to her aunt a while, then went to bed. Next day Carley motored through Central Park and out of town into Westchester County, finding some relief from the stifling heat. But she seemed to look at the dusty trees and worn greens without really seeing them. In the afternoon she called on friends, and had dinner at home with her aunt, and then went to a theater. The musical comedy was good, but the almost unbearable heat and the vitiated air spoiled her enjoyment. That night, upon arriving home at midnight, she stepped out of the taxi and involuntarily, without thought, looked up to see the stars. But there were no stars. A murky yellow tinged blackness hung low over the city. Carley recollected that stars and sunrises and sunsets and untainted air and silence were not for city dwellers. She checked any continuation of the thought. A few days sufficed to swing her into the old life. Many of Carley's friends had neither the leisure nor the means to go away from the city during the summer. Some there were who might have afforded that if they had seen fit to live in less showy apartments or to dispense with cars. Others of her best friends were on their summer outings in the Adirondacks. Carley decided to go with her aunt to Lake Placid about the 1st of August. Meanwhile, she would keep going and doing. She had been a week in town before Morrison telephoned her and added his welcome. Despite the gay gladness of his voice, it irritated her. Really, she scarcely wanted to see him. But a meeting was inevitable, and besides, going out with him was in accordance with the plan she had adopted. So she made an engagement to meet him at the plaza for dinner. When, with slow and pondering action, she hung up the receiver, it occurred to her that she resented the idea of going to the plaza. She did not dwell on the reason why. When Carley went into the reception room of the plaza that night, Morrison was waiting for her. The same slim, fastidious, elegant, sallow-faced Morrison whose image she had in mind, yet somehow different. He had what Carley called the New York masculine face, blasé and lined, with eyes that gleamed yet had no fire. But at sight of her his face lighted up. "By Jove, you've come back a peach!" he exclaimed, clasping her extended hand. "Eleanor told me you looked great. It's worth missing you to see you like this." "Thanks, Larry," she replied. "I must look pretty well to win that compliment from you. And how are you feeling? You don't seem robust for a golfer and horseman, but then I'm used to husky Westerners." "Oh, I'm fagged with the daily grind," he said. "I'll be glad to get up in the mountains next month. Let's go down to dinner." They descended the spiral stairway to the grill room, where an orchestra was playing jazz, and dancers gyrated on a polished floor, and diners in evening dress looked on over their cigarettes. "Well, Carley, are you still finicky about the eats?" he queried, consulting the menu. "No, but I prefer plain food," she replied. "Have a cigarette," he said, holding out a silver monogrammed case. "Thanks, Larry. I guess I'll not take up smoking again. You see, while I was West I got out of the habit." "Yes, they told me you had changed," he returned. "How about drinking?" "Why, I thought New York had gone dry," she said, forcing a laugh. "Only on the surface. Underneath it's wetter than ever." "Well, I'll obey the law." He ordered a rather elaborate dinner, and then turning his attention to Carley, gave her a closer scrutiny. Carley knew then that he had become acquainted with the fact of her broken engagement. It was a relief not to need to tell him. "How's that big stiff Kilbourne?" asked Morrison suddenly. "Is it true he got well?" "Oh, yes, he's fine," replied Carley, with eyes cast down. A hot knot seemed to form deep within her and threatened to break and steal along her veins. "But if you please, I do not care to talk of him." "Naturally. But I must tell you that one man's loss is another's gain." Carley had rather expected renewed courtship from Morrison. She had not, however, been prepared for the beat of her pulse, the quiver of her nerves, the uprising of hot resentment at the mere mention of Kilbourne. It was only natural that Glenn's former rivals should speak of him, and perhaps disparagingly. But from this man Carley could not bear even a casual reference. Morrison had escaped the army service. He had been given a high salaried post at the shipyards, the duties of which, if there had been any, he performed wherever he happened to be. Morrison's father had made a fortune in leather during the war, and Carley remembered Glenn telling her that he had seen 2 whole blocks in Paris piled 20 feet deep with leather army goods that were never used and probably never had been intended to be used. Morrison represented the not inconsiderable number of young men in New York who had gained at the expense of the valiant legion who had lost. But what had Morrison gained? Carley raised her eyes to gaze steadily at him. He looked well fed, indolent, rich, effete, and supremely self-satisfied. She could not see that he had gained anything. She would rather have been a crippled, ruined soldier. "Larry, I fear gain and loss are mere words," she said. "The thing that counts with me is what you are." He stared at her in well-bred surprise, and presently talked of a new dance which had lately come into vogue. And from that he passed on to gossip of the theaters. Once between courses of the dinner he asked Carley to dance, and she complied. The music would have stimulated an Egyptian mummy, Carley thought, and the subdued rose lights, the murmur of gay voices, the glide and grace and distortion of the dancers were exciting and pleasurable. Morrison had the suppleness and skill of a dancing master, but he held Carley too tightly, and so she told him, and added, "I imbibed some fresh, pure air while I was out West, something you haven't here, and I don't want it all squeezed out of me." The latter days of July Carley made busy, so busy that she lost her tan and appetite, and something of her splendid resistance to the dragging heat and late hours. Seldom was she without some of her friends. She accepted almost any kind of invitation, and went to Coney Island, to baseball games, to motion pictures, which were 3 forms of amusement not customary with her. At Coney Island, which she visited with 2 of her younger girl friends, she had the best time since her arrival home. What had put her in accord with ordinary people, the baseball games likewise pleased her. The running of the players and the screaming of the spectators amused and excited her. But she hated the motion pictures with their salacious and absurd misrepresentations of life, in some cases capably acted by skillful actors, and in others a silly series of scenes featuring some doll-faced girl. But she refused to go horseback riding in Central Park. She refused to go to the Plaza, and these refusals she made deliberately, without asking herself why. On August 1st she accompanied her aunt and several friends to Lake Placid, where they established themselves at a hotel. How welcome to Carley's strained eyes were the green mountains, the soft gleam of amber water. How sweet and refreshing a breath of cool, pure air! The change from New York's glare and heat and dirt and iron red insulating walls and thronging millions of people and ceaseless roar and rush was tremendously relieving to Carley. She had burned the candle at both ends, but the beauty of the hills and vales, the quiet of the forest, the sight of the stars made it harder to forget. She had to rest, and when she rested she could not always converse or read or write. For the most part her days held variety and pleasure. The place was beautiful, the weather pleasant, the people congenial. She motored over the forest roads. She canoed along the margin of the lake. She played golf and tennis. She wore exquisite gowns to dinner and danced during the evenings. But she seldom walked anywhere on the trails and never alone. And she never climbed the mountains and never rode a horse. Morrison arrived and added his attentions to those of other men. Carley neither accepted nor repelled them. She favored the association with married couples and older people, and rather shunned the pairing off peculiar to vacationists at summer hotels. She had always loved to play and romp with children, but here she found herself growing to avoid them, somehow hurt by sound of pattering feet and joyous laughter. She filled the days as best she could, and usually earned quick slumber at night. She staked all on present occupation and the truth of flying time. Chapter 9.